The agricultural equipment dealership network in northwestern Ohio had been moving a specific piece of information through its informal channels since the third week of October in 1987, and the specific piece of information had been producing the specific kind of silence that conversations produced in the farm equipment industry when the information was unusual enough to require processing before any response was appropriate. The information was this. A farmer from Putnam County had walked into a consortium of 3 dealerships, 2 John Deere franchises and 1 Case IH franchise, all within a 40-mile radius of each other in the Ottawa-Findlay corridor, and had placed purchase orders for 30 tractors to be paid in cash at a combined purchase price that the 3 dealerships' general managers had initially received as the kind of statement that required verification before belief. The farmer's name was Conrad Metzger, and he was 63 years old, and he had been farming Putnam County ground since 1948, when he had come back from the service and had taken over the operation his father had built across the 1930s and 1940s from a starting position of a single rented 80-acre parcel and the specific discipline of a German Catholic Putnam County farming family that had understood since the Depression that the difference between keeping the land and losing it was the same discipline applied across every season, regardless of what the season's conditions invited or permitted. The community that knew Conrad Metzger had not thought he had money in the specific way that the October 1987 30-tractor transaction revealed money. The Putnam County farming community had known him for 39 years as a man who farmed carefully, who maintained his equipment at the standard his service logs documented without exception, who made equipment acquisitions from dispersals and estate sales at prices reflecting the used equipment market rather than the new equipment market, and who had never, in 39 years of community observation, purchased new equipment from a dealership or discussed the farm's financial position in any terms more specific than the general answers that a farming man gave when his operation's health was a reasonable topic of agricultural community conversation. The general answers Conrad gave had been the general answers of a man whose operation was adequate, carefully managed, not in difficulty, and not in a position to participate in the equipment upgrade cycles that the newer equipment advertising and the dealer relationships had been generating in Putnam County across the 1970s and 1980s. The community had assessed the Metzger operation as conservative, well-maintained, modestly scaled, and essentially not in the category of operations that were going to be participating in the kind of large equipment transactions that the community paid attention to. The community had been wrong. Not wrong in its observations. The observations of a 39-year neighbor were accurate in their individual components. The Metzger operation was conservative, well-maintained, and did not participate in equipment upgrade cycles at the new equipment dealer level. The community had been wrong in its inference. The inference that an operation that did not participate in equipment upgrade cycles at the dealer level was an operation that did not have the financial position to do so. The farm account that Conrad had been maintaining since 1948, when he had started it in the format his father had used since the 1930s, had 2 accumulation columns that the community had not known about. The first was the Equipment Fund column, established in January of 1950 at a contribution rate of 10% of net operating surplus. The second was the Land Fund column, added in 1955 at 6% of net operating surplus after the Equipment Fund's 5-year accumulation had demonstrated that the mechanism worked, and that the same mechanism applied to land acquisition would produce the same results over a longer timeline. Both columns had been building since their establishment dates without the community's knowledge, because the farm account was not a public document, and because the farm's visible management behavior had communicated restraint rather than accumulation to the observers who watched the visible evidence. The Equipment Fund had been building for 37 years by October of 1987. The Land Fund had been building for 32 years. The farm account's operating surplus had grown proportionally with the farm's scale, and the farm's scale had grown from the original rented 80 acres to 1,740 owned acres across the 35 years, from 1952 to 1987, assembled through 32 land acquisitions that the Land Fund had financed in cash or near-cash terms without institutional debt against any acre. 1,740 acres, no institutional debt. 2 fund columns, 37 years. The Putnam County farming community had known about the land accumulation. It had been impossible not to know, given the scale and the duration of the acquisitions, but had assessed the acquisitions within the framework the visible evidence supported. Conrad had been acquiring parcels gradually, 1 or 2 at a time, in the cash transactions that his careful operations surplus had produced over decades. The assessment had been accurate as a description of the mechanism. It had been incomplete as an understanding of the scale and the duration and the discipline that the mechanism represented. The Equipment Fund's accumulation had been invisible to the community because no deployment event had occurred to make it visible. The fleet management across 37 years had been handled through the dispersal methodology, used equipment from estate sales and farm dispersals, assessed through the compression reading methodology and the service log analysis before bidding, acquired at prices, the assessment supported, maintained at the standard the service logs documented. The dispersal methodology had been adequate for the fleet's management without requiring the Equipment Fund's capital. The fund had been accumulating without a deployment event for 37 years. The operating surplus had grown with the farm's scale. The contribution rate had remained at 10% throughout. The compounding effect of a 10% contribution on a growing income base across 37 years produced, in October of 1987, the balance that the Putnam County National Bank had certified in the letter that the 3 dealerships' general managers had read in silence before anyone had said anything worth recording. The first dealer to respond after the silence had been Troutman, the general manager of the Ottawa John Deere franchise, who had been running the Ottawa dealership since 1974 and who had seen a range of purchase situations in 13 years. He had read the bank letter, set it on his desk and said, "This is verified." He had called the Putnam County National Bank while Conrad Metzger waited in the chair across his desk, and the bank's president had confirmed the letter's content directly. The balance was real. The liquid position it described was real. The certification was authentic. Troutman had said, after replacing the receiver, "I apologize for the verification call. It's the first time I've needed to make one on a document like this." Conrad had said, "I assumed it would be necessary. That's why I brought the letter rather than just telling you the number." Troutman had said, "You anticipated the verification need." Conrad had said, "I anticipated that the number would seem unusual to someone who knew only my transaction history with the dealership." The verification call was the right professional response. I would have done the same. This exchange, Conrad anticipating the verification need and bringing the bank letter specifically to address it, had been the first indication to Troutman that the purchase had been as carefully planned as any transaction he had handled in 13 years. The bank letter had not been the spontaneous documentation of a man who happened to have the money. It had been the prepared documentation of a man who had been planning the transaction for 2 years and who had anticipated every element of the conversation that the planning required him to have. The planning had begun in the fall of 1985, when the Equipment Fund's balance had crossed the threshold Conrad had been calculating since the late 1970s as the level that would make a fleet-scale replacement transaction possible. The threshold had not been a specific dollar amount. It had been a relationship between the fund's balance, the expected package discount for a cash purchase at scale in the market conditions that were likely to prevail, and the number of machines the fleet assessment identified as needing replacement within a specific window. The fleet assessment had been the output of the compression reading series that Conrad had maintained on every machine in the Metzger fleet since the late 1950s. 30 machines in 1985, each with its own service log, each with its own reading series going back to the machine's arrival in the Metzger fleet, each with its drift rate calculated annually and its remaining service life estimate updated each spring. The assessment in the fall of 1985 had identified 14 machines, the oldest in the fleet, ranging from 1962 to 1972 vintage, as entering the rebuild or replace phase within the following 3 to 5 years, not all 14 at once. In sequence, as the readings of each machine crossed the threshold where the rebuild or replace decision became economically necessary rather than merely possible. The sequence had been projected from the drift rate analysis: 3 machines in 1986, 1987, 4 more in 1987, 1989, 7 more in 1989 to 1993. The sequence created a management question. Address each machine reactively as it crossed the threshold, rebuilding or replacing on a machine-by-machine basis as the readings required, or assess the full fleet situation and consider whether a single comprehensive replacement transaction made more economic sense than the sequential approach. Conrad had done the comparison in the winter of 1985-1986, using the farm accounts cost analysis framework that he had been applying to equipment decisions since the early 1960s. The comparison had considered the total cost of the sequential rebuild or replace approach over 8 years, including labor, parts, and the opportunity cost of having machines in the rebuild phase during critical seasonal windows, versus the total cost of a single comprehensive fleet replacement from the equipment fund at the package discount that a 30-unit cash purchase would command in the dealership market of the following 1 to 2 years. The comparison had produced a clear result. The single comprehensive transaction was more economical than the sequential approach by a margin that the fund's current balance and the projected package discount made achievable. The more economical outcome had also the specific operational advantage of a uniform fleet vintage. 30 machines of comparable age would enter the next maintenance cycle together, allowing the service log methodology to be applied more efficiently to a standardized fleet than to a mixed fleet of machines in different phases of their wear cycles. The single comprehensive transaction had been the correct decision. The timing of the transaction had been the secondary question. When would the combination of the fund balance and the market conditions produce the optimal package discount? The farm crisis of 1981-1982 had begun unwinding the boom-era equipment market, and the dealerships in the Ottawa-Findlay corridor had been managing elevated inventory levels since 1983. The elevated inventory had produced the specific dealership economics that a cash buyer of scale could exploit. The financing cost on the sitting inventory was a real cost to the dealership, and a cash transaction that cleared 10 units of sitting inventory simultaneously produced a benefit to the dealership that justified a discount level that the normal market would not support. Conrad had been monitoring the 3 dealerships' inventory levels annually since 1985, making the observation circuit that his assessment of the optimal timing required. The October 1987 observation had confirmed that the inventory levels were still elevated enough and the dealership's financing costs were still pressing enough that the discount range his model had calculated would be available. The fund balance in October 1987 was at the level the model required. The inventory conditions were at the level the model required. The fleet assessment sequence had put 3 machines in immediate need of replacement and 4 more approaching the threshold within 12 to 18 months. The conditions had converged. He had made the contact with the 3 dealerships in the second week of October. The Ottawa dealership first, Troutman's franchise. 10 units, specific models identified by function in the Metzger operations fleet structure. The discount range proposed as a starting point for the conversation. Troutman had asked for time to review the proposal. He had called the bank the following morning. The Findlay dealership second, a franchise that had been in the corridor since the 1960s. 10 units, the Case IH complement of the overall fleet structure, similar terms. The Findlay general manager had also called the bank. The Findlay general manager's silence had been longer than Troutman's, 14 seconds by the sales staff's subsequent account, though the precise measurement was the kind of retrospective estimate that people made when they were describing unusual moments. The third dealership, a second JD franchise in Paulding, had received the inquiry by phone before the in-person meeting, at Conrad's deliberate choice. He had wanted the Paulding franchise to have the bank letter in hand before the in-person conversation, rather than experiencing the silence at the desk. The Paulding general manager had said on the call, "I've read the letter 3 times. The number is correct?" Conrad had said, "The number is correct." The Paulding general manager had said, "I'll see you Thursday." The 3 conversations had been completed over a 2-week period in October. The terms had been negotiated without the drama that the scale of the transaction might have suggested. Conrad had proposed discount ranges that each dealership's economics supported at a 10-unit cash purchase in the current inventory environment, and each dealership had accepted within those ranges because the economics were accurate and the cash certainty eliminated the credit risk and inventory financing cost simultaneously. The combined package discount across the 3 transactions had been 22% below aggregate list price, the largest aggregate discount any of the 3 franchises had extended in their operating histories, and the discount that Conrad's inventory monitoring and dealership economics analysis had modeled as the appropriate fare range for the specific transaction in the specific market conditions. The transactions had closed in the last week of October and the first week of November. The checks had cleared. The delivery schedule had been coordinated across all 3 dealerships to bring the 30 machines to the Metzger operations' multiple locations across the Blanchard River drainage efficiently and without the confusion that 30 separate delivery schedules might have produced. The deliveries had been completed by December 15th. The Metzger Equipment Fund column had been at 0 by December 15th. The rebuild entry had been in the farm account by December 15th. Equipment Fund rebuild, December 1987, opening balance 0. 10% at the established rate. The Putnam County farming community had received the October 1987 transaction through the elevator network and the co-op and the informal discussions at the feed store and the implement parts counter where agricultural information moved at the speed of agricultural communities' attention to their members' significant events. The reception had produced, in sequence, disbelief, verification through the specific sources that verification required in agricultural communities. The elevator operator who had heard from the Paulding dealership's delivery driver, the Farm Bureau officer who had heard from Troutman, and then the specific community-wide revision that the verified information required. The revision had been the most complete community-wide reassessment of a single farming operations position in Putnam County, in the memory of the community's oldest observers, not because the Metzger operation had changed. It was the same operation it had always been, but because the community's understanding of what the operation had always been had changed. A neighboring farmer named Dietsch, who had been farming adjacent to one of the Metzger parcels in the Blanchard River drainage since the early 1970s and who had watched the Metzger operation across 15 years from the adjacent field road, had said at the Farm Bureau meeting in November of 1987, "I thought I knew Konrad Metzger. I watched his operation for 15 years. I saw the older machines and the dispersal acquisitions and the careful management. I thought I was watching a man who managed carefully because he didn't have much. I was watching a man who managed carefully because he understood that management is how you build what you have. Those are different things." Konrad had been at the Farm Bureau meeting. He had said, in response to Dietsch's observation, the discipline and the accumulation are not separate things. The discipline is the mechanism that produces the accumulation. The accumulation is what the discipline is building toward. The community saw the discipline. It didn't see what the discipline was building. The fund is where the building was visible, and the fund is private. He had said, the 30 tractors in October were the fund's first major deployment in 37 years. The fund had been accumulating since 1950 through every season, good years, difficult years, the farm crisis years when the contribution was smaller but the percentage was maintained. The accumulated balance in October of 1987 was 37 years of 10% at an increasing income base as the farm's scale grew. The transaction was the first time the accumulation became visible to anyone outside the farm account. He had also said, the silence in the Ottawa dealership was 11 seconds. I estimated 12. Closer in Findlay, the room had laughed. The Putnam County farming community had found this genuinely funny, not at Konrad's expense, but with him, at the specific image of a 63-year-old Putnam County farmer sitting across a desk from a dealership general manager, while the general manager processed a bank letter in 11 seconds of silence. The laugh had been the specific laugh of people who understood both sides of the situation clearly enough to find the image complete and human. Konrad had said, I did not expect the silence to be amusing when I anticipated it. I expected it to be the professional pause of a man processing unexpected information. It was that. It was also the specific sound of a number that the visible evidence had not prepared anyone to hear. The Farm Bureau meeting had been the occasion for several Putnam County farmers to ask Konrad specific questions about the fund column. How the rate had been set, how it had been maintained through the difficult years, how the accumulation had grown with the farm's scale, how the transaction timing had been planned. He had answered all of the questions directly and without the deflection that private financial information typically generated in the agricultural community's conversations. He had answered directly because the transaction had already made the information public. The 30 tractors were in the fields. The community knew what the bank letter had described, and the only question remaining was the methodology, which was the information that would be useful to others. The methodology had been in the farm account since 1950. The methodology was simple. Establish the contribution rate at a level that the farm's income could sustain in difficult years, not just in good years. Maintain the rate without exception. Let the accumulation grow with the farm's scale. Do not deploy until the threshold and the opportunity converge simultaneously. The threshold in 1987 had been the fund balance needed for the fleet replacement at the discount the market would support. The opportunity in 1987 had been the dealership inventory environment, the fleet assessment's replacement window, and the convergence of all three conditions simultaneously. The convergence had taken 37 years to produce. The transaction had taken 2 weeks to complete. That was the relationship between the patience and the transaction. That was the relationship between the discipline and the silence. The discipline had been running for 37 years. The silence had been 11 seconds. Both were exact. Both were the same thing expressed in different units. The farm account was on the kitchen table. The equipment fund was at zero. The rebuild had begun. as it had begun in every year since 1950, from zero, at 10%. That was sufficient. That was the whole account. That was everything. The 30 tractors were in the fields. The community had the answer to the question it had not known it was asking for 39 years. The question had been, what is the discipline building toward? The answer had been 30 tractors and 11 seconds of silence. That was the whole account. That was everything. The specific account of how Conrad had developed the fleet assessment methodology deserved a fuller treatment than the compressed description of the compression reading series could provide, because the methodology's application to 30 machines simultaneously was the specific technical foundation of the October 1987 transactions planning, and because the methodology had been refined over 37 years in ways that the general description did not capture. Conrad had started taking compression readings on the Metzger fleet machines in 1958, 10 years into his primary management and 8 years after the equipment fund column had been established. The 10-year gap between the fund's establishment and the reading series beginning was not an oversight. It was the specific sequence of learning that the farm accounts management had produced. The equipment fund had been established first, because the financial mechanism was the primary need. The reading methodology had been added when the management experience had produced the specific question that the methodology answered. How do I know when the machines I have been acquiring from dispersals are approaching the point where the rebuild or replace decision becomes necessary? The question had been produced by the 1957 experience with a 1948 Farmall M that Conrad had acquired from a Putnam County dispersal in 1952 for $140, and that had experienced a major engine failure in the spring of 1957 during planting. A field failure at the worst possible moment that had required emergency parts sourcing and a 4-day repair that had put 3 fields behind the planting window. The 1957 failure had been the specific experience that had made the rebuild or replace management question urgent rather than theoretical. Conrad had not known in 1952, when he had assessed the dispersal M by appearance and running condition, that the engine was closer to its replacement threshold than its purchase price and condition had communicated. He had not known because he had not had the methodology to assess the engine's position in its wear cycle rather than its current operational condition. The current operational condition and the position in the wear cycle were different information. A machine could be in current operational condition, running, working, not obviously malfunctioning, while being much closer to the replacement threshold than its current operational condition suggested. The compression reading series was the instrument that revealed the position in the wear cycle, distinct from the current operational condition. Conrad had purchased a compression gauge at the Van Wert County equipment supplier in the fall of 1957, after the planting season failure had made the need for the position in wear cycle assessment obvious, and had taken the first readings on the Metzger fleet's remaining machines that November. He had also contacted the Putnam County Extension Office and had found the documentation on the compression reading methodology that the Extension Service had been distributing since the mid-1950s. The specific technical guidance that described the procedure, the recording format, and the interpretation of multi-year reading series. The extension documentation had described the drift rate interpretation, the calculation that converted year-over-year readings into a trajectory rather than a collection of data points, in the specific terms that the extension engineer who had developed the methodology had found most useful for a working farmer's application. Conrad had read the documentation 3 times and had begun the reading series on all 14 machines then in the Metzger fleet, using the format and the recording procedure the documentation specified. The reading series from 1957 had established baselines for the fleet. The reading series from 1958 had produced the first year of year-over-year comparison data. By 1960, 3 years of readings had produced the first reliable drift rate calculations for the machines in the fleet. By 1965, 8 years of readings had produced the longitudinal records that the remaining service life projections could be based on with reasonable confidence. The confidence in the projections had grown with the length of the reading series because the longer series smoothed the year-over-year variation and revealed the underlying trend more clearly. In the early years of the series, 1957 to 1962, the drift rate calculations had been informed estimates from limited data. By 1975, with 18 years of consistent readings on the machines that had been in the fleet since the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the drift rate calculations had been the kind of reliable projections that the 1957 failure's consequence had made Conrad determined to develop. The 30 machines in the 1985 fleet assessment had been at various stages of their reading series. The oldest machines had reading series going back 25 years. The most recently acquired dispersal machines had reading series going back 5 to 8 years. The assessment had used the reading series length as a confidence weighting for the drift rate projections. Longer series produced more confident projections. Shorter series produced projections with wider uncertainty ranges. The assessment had identified the 14 machines in the rebuild or replace window based on the intersection of 3 criteria. The current readings below a specified threshold relative to the manufacturer's specification, the drift rate showing acceleration consistent with the approach of the replacement threshold, and the remaining service life projection at the current drift rate showing 3 to 5 years before the threshold would be crossed. All 3 criteria had to be met for a machine to be classified as in the rebuild or replace window. This conservative classification approach had ensured that the window assessment was not overstating the replacement need. Machines that met only 1 or 2 of the criteria had been classified as requiring monitoring rather than replacement, and had not been included in the comprehensive transaction calculation. The 14 machines that met all 3 criteria in 1985 had been verified by reassessment in 1986 and again in 1987, confirming that the 1985 projection had been accurate. The drift rates had continued on the trajectories the 1985 assessment had described, and the 3 machines at the most advanced stage of the rebuild or replace window had crossed the threshold in 1986 and 1987 as the projection had indicated they would. The verification had confirmed the transaction's timing. The fund had been at the threshold in October 1987. The fleet assessment had been verified across 2 additional years of readings. The market conditions had been confirmed through the inventory observation circuit. The transaction was correct. Conrad had described this verification process to the Farm Bureau meeting in November of 1987 in response to a question from Renneker, a Mercer County farmer who had attended the meeting as a guest and who had been applying his own compression reading methodology since the early 1980s. Renneker had asked, "How many years did the reading series have on the machines you identified as in the replacement window?" Conrad had said the 14 machines in the window had reading series ranging from 13 to 22 years. The 3 in the most advanced stage had 22, 21, and 19 years of readings. The confidence in those 3 projections was high. 20-plus years of consistent readings in the same format at the same conditions produces a drift rate calculation with very low uncertainty. Those 3 projections were within 2 months of when the threshold was actually crossed in 1986 and 1987. Renneker had said 2 months accuracy on a projection made 2 years earlier. Conrad had said the projection was made in 1985 from the 1985 readings. The readings had confirmed the projection in 1986 and 1987. The accuracy was 2 months on a 2-year projection, which is approximately 8%. For farm management planning purposes, 8% accuracy is sufficient to make the decision confidently. Renneker had said, 22 years of readings. Conrad had said, the machine had been in the Metzger fleet since 1963. I started the reading series in 1958 and took the first reading on that specific machine in 1963 when it arrived. 22 years by 1985. Renneker had been quiet for a moment. He had said the transaction in October was the output of 22 years of annual readings on the machines at the leading edge of the replacement window. Conrad had said the transaction was the output of 37 years of the equipment fund column and 22 years of the longest reading series in the fleet and 28 years of the others. The transaction required both. The fund provided the capital. The reading series provided the timing. This description, the fund provided the capital, the reading series provided the timing, had been the most compact articulation of the two parallel instruments that the transaction had required. The fund had been building the financial capacity for 37 years. The reading series had been building the technical knowledge for 22 to 28 years. Neither alone had been sufficient for the October 1987 transaction. Together, they had been precisely sufficient. Trautman had asked Conrad during the Ottawa transaction's completion process whether the reading series methodology was something that the Putnam County Extension Service had developed or whether it had come from the dealership's service recommendations. Conrad had said, from the Extension Service documentation from 1957 and 58. The Extension Service distributed a technical bulletin on the compression reading interpretation methodology for farm equipment diesel engines. I found the bulletin through the County Extension Office in the fall of 1957 after a field failure that made the need for the methodology obvious. I've been using it since 1958. Trautman had said 30 years of the methodology. Conrad had said 29 years when I did the fleet assessment in 1985. The methodology was the reason the assessment could be done with the confidence the transaction planning required. Without the reading series, the fleet assessment would have been an inspection. The inspection would have produced a current condition opinion. The reading series produced a trajectory and a projected timeline. The transaction required the timeline, not the inspection. Trautman had said the timeline justified the transaction's comprehensiveness. Conrad had said the timeline justified the comprehensive approach rather than the sequential approach. Sequential replacement as each machine crossed the threshold would have been more expensive and more disruptive than the comprehensive replacement from the fund at the package discount. The timeline made the comparison calculation possible. The comparison calculation made the comprehensive approach identifiable as the more economical choice. This exchange, the timeline made the comparison calculation possible, had been Trautman's most complete understanding of how the October transaction had been produced, not as a single act of financial capacity, but as the output of two parallel instruments, the fund's financial accumulation and the reading series' technical accumulation that had been running simultaneously for decades and had converged in October of 1987 at the specific conditions that made the transaction the correct decision. Trautman had described this to the Dealer Association meeting in Columbus in early 1988 in the specific context of the crisis-era lessons that the agricultural equipment industry had been developing from the boom and crash cycle. He had said, "The most professionally significant transaction I handled in 1987 was not the largest in dollar terms, though it was substantial. It was the most carefully planned. The buyer had been accumulating the capital for 37 years and the technical knowledge for 29 years simultaneously. The transaction took 2 weeks to complete. The preparation took the equivalent of a lifetime. I sat across from a man whose account history with my dealership was essentially blank, whose community's assessment was that he managed carefully because he didn't have much, and whose farm account had been running 2 accumulation columns toward this specific transaction since 1950. The silence at my desk was 11 seconds. I should have known to ask a different question. Someone in the Dealer Association audience had asked, "What different question?" Trotman had said, "Any question that looked behind the transaction history to the account." The transaction history told me his account was thin. The account told a different story. I never asked about the account. The bank letter asked it for me, in the best possible way. He had said, "The lesson is not to ask customers about their financial position in a presumptuous way. The lesson is to not let the transaction history substitute for the account. The transaction history and the account are different things." The Metzger transaction made this clear in a way I have not forgotten and will not forget. The Dealer Association had received this account with the attention that professionally honest accounts of professional errors received from audiences who recognized the error's general validity beyond the specific instance. Several members had subsequently described the Metzger transaction to their own sales staffs as the example of the transaction history versus the account distinction. The distinction had entered the northwestern Ohio agricultural equipment industry's professional vocabulary, quietly, without attribution to any specific transaction, in the specific form that useful professional lessons took when they were too precise to be dismissed and too useful to be withheld. Conrad had continued farming the Putnam County ground through the subsequent years, with the 30 new machines, the service log methodology applied to the new fleet from the first season, the compression baselines established in the spring of 1988, and the reading series begun in the format that the Extension Bulletin had described in 1957, and that 30 years of application had refined without changing. The equipment fund column in the farm account had been rebuilding from zero since December of 1987, at 10%, at the established rate. The fund would build for however many years the next threshold required, and the next deployment event would be when the threshold and the right opportunity converged. The reading series on the 30 new machines would be providing the technical information that the next deployment event would require, building from the 1988 baselines. Through however many years the new fleet served the Putnam County ground before the rebuild or replace window opened. The fund and the reading series were running simultaneously, as they had been running since 1958, as they would run through whatever seasons followed. That was the discipline. That was the whole of it. The farm account was on the kitchen table. The fund was at zero. The rebuild had begun. The baselines were in the service logs. The reading series had begun for 30 new machines, 37 years to 30 tractors, and 11 seconds of silence. Then, zero again. Then the rebuild. Then the reading series from the new baselines. Then whatever the decades produced. That was sufficient. That was everything. The discipline continued. The farm continued. Into the next November review. Into the next season. Into the next decade. That was the whole account. That was the whole of it. The 32 land acquisitions that had assembled the 1,740 acres of Putnam County ground by 1987 were not random purchases of available parcels. They were the output of a land acquisition methodology that Conrad had been applying since 1955, with the same systematic attention he had been applying to the fleet assessment methodology since 1958. The land methodology had been established first, before the fleet methodology, because the first priority in 1955 had been the transition from rented ground to owned ground at the scale that the farm accounts land fund column could support. The land fund had been established in 1955, 5 years after the equipment fund, because the first 5 years of the equipment fund's accumulation had demonstrated that the mechanism worked in practice rather than just in principle. The equipment fund had been building since 1950, By 1955, 5 years of consistent 10% contributions from an operation that had been growing as the farm account surplus allowed had produced a balance that Conrad had confirmed was accumulating toward the equipment threshold he had initially calculated. The mechanism had been validated by 5 years of data, rather than by theoretical projection. The land fund at 6% had been established with the same validation logic applied to a longer time horizon. 6% of a growing operating surplus directed consistently to the land fund over multiple decades would produce acquisition capacity at the intervals that the Putnam County grounds, availability patterns, and pricing dynamics would periodically create. The fund did not target specific parcels. It built the capacity to respond correctly when the right parcels became available at the right prices. The first land acquisition from the fund had been the Kirchner, 46 acres, in the spring of 1957, 2 years after the fund's establishment. The Kirchner family had been the Metzger farm's northern neighbor since the 1930s, and the patriarch had died in the winter of 1956-1957, leaving 2 adult children in Columbus and 1 in Cincinnati, who had inherited a 46-acre Putnam County parcel that none of them intended to farm, and all of them intended to sell. The fund had been at the acquisition threshold for a parcel of that size when Conrad had contacted the Cincinnati heir in January of 1957 and had offered to purchase the ground before the family engaged a real estate agent. The transaction had closed in March of 1957. Cash from the land fund. The fund had gone to zero and the rebuild had begun in April of 1957 at 6%. The pattern had repeated 31 additional times across the following 30 years. Each acquisition had been from the fund at the accumulated threshold, each at a price that the Putnam County grounds market produced when the estate or succession situation had created the seller's incentive to complete a transaction directly, rather than through the time and cost of listing and marketing. Not all 32 acquisitions had been below market. Several had been at full market prices because the parcels had been competitively sought and Conrad's cash and certainty position had been the competitive advantage rather than a price advantage. The cash and certainty position had been the consistent advantage across all 32 acquisitions. A seller dealing with an estate situation or a succession decision was facing a specific combination of emotional and logistical complexity that made certainty valuable beyond its monetary equivalent. Conrad's position, cash available, transaction close time measured in days rather than weeks or months, no contingencies, no financing approval delays, had been worth a premium to sellers whose alternative was a longer and more complex process. He had not exploited this premium systematically. The prices he had paid had been fair market prices in most cases, with modest discounts in cases where the estate's specific situation had created both the need for speed and the opportunity for a slight below-market transaction. The fair pricing had been a deliberate approach, rather than a generosity. He had said to his son, in one of the kitchen table discussions that the farm's management had always used for transmission of the methodology, that fair pricing in transactions with neighbors and neighboring estates built the reputation that made the next transaction available. The reputation for fair dealing was more valuable than any individual price advantage, because the reputation was what produced the calls before the listing rather than after it. The reputation had been producing calls since the mid-1960s, when the Putnam County farming community had understood that Conrad Metzger would close a transaction quickly and fairly when the right parcel became available. The knowledge had traveled through the community's network, through the estate attorneys who had seen Conrad close without complications, through the Farm Bureau officers who had observed the pattern of acquisitions, through the farming families who had watched the Metzger operation grow one reliable transaction at a time across the years. Conrad had said to the Farm Bureau meeting in November of 1987, in response to a question about how he had identified the acquisition opportunities, "I didn't identify them. They came to me." The reputation for closing quickly and fairly at a reasonable price traveled through the county's network over time and produced the calls. The fund provided the capacity to respond correctly when the calls came. Without the fund, the reputation would not have mattered because the capacity would not have been there. Without the reputation, the fund would have been waiting longer for each opportunity because the sellers would not have called first. He had said, "The fund and the reputation work together the same way the fund and the reading series work together. Neither one alone produces the outcome. Together, they produce the outcome consistently." This description, the fund and the reputation together, the fund and the reading series together, had been the Farm Bureau meeting's clearest account of the Metzger methodology's structure. Two pairs of complementary instruments, each pair producing outcomes that neither instrument could have produced alone, both pairs operating simultaneously across the same decades of the farm accounts discipline. The fund was the financial instrument. The reputation was the social instrument. The reading series was the technical instrument. The methodology was the analytical instrument. All four had been running since the mid-1950s and late 1950s, building the capacity that the October 1987 transaction had required. The community had seen the fund's absence of deployment, the conservatism, the dispersal acquisitions, the maintained equipment. The community had seen the reputation's evidence, the land acquisitions, the fair dealing accounts, the estate families who had mentioned the Metzger name when asked about Putnam County ground buyers. The community had not seen the reading series or the methodology because they lived in the service logs and the farm accounts assessment sections that were not public documents. The October 1987 transaction had made all four instruments visible simultaneously: the fund's balance in the bank letter, the reading series output in the fleet assessment that had driven the transaction's timing, the reputation's accumulation in the 32 land acquisitions that constituted the 1,740 acres, and the methodology's precision in the transaction structure that had been modeled to be fair to both parties before the first dealership contact. All four instruments had been running since the 1950s. The community had seen two of them and had assessed the farm as conservative and modest. The October 1987 transaction had revealed all four and produced the reassessment. The reassessment had been the specific revision that Deitch had described at the Farm Bureau meeting. From watching a man manage carefully because he didn't have much to understanding a man who managed carefully because he understood that management is how you build what you have. The build had been occurring for 37 years. The community had been watching it without seeing it. The transaction had made it visible. The silence had been 11 seconds. The build had been 37 years. Both were exact. The 11 seconds was the sound of 37 years, arriving in a bank letter on a desk in October of 1987. That was the whole account. That was the whole of it. The December 1987 entry in the farm account, equipment fund, opening balance 0, 10% established rate, and beside it, in the land fund column, opening balance 0, 6% established rate, both at 0, both rebuilding, as they had always rebuilt. After every deployment from every 0, that was sufficient, that was everything. The son, who had been learning the methodology at the Metzger kitchen table since his early teens, Carl, who was 35 in 1987 and who had been in primary management alongside Conrad since 1980, had been present at the 3 dealership conversations in October and had been the person who had coordinated the delivery logistics across the 3 franchises and the multiple Metzger farm locations in November and December. Carl had said to Conrad on the evening of the last delivery, December 15, The dealers are going to tell this story for 30 years. Conrad had said, Troutman already has. He described it to the Case IH dealers at a regional meeting in Columbus in November. I heard from the Delphos Case dealer that the story was circulating. Carl had said, does that concern you? Conrad had said, the story is accurate. The accuracy is not concerning. If the story produces some benefit to other farming operations by describing the methodology, that is an additional outcome I did not anticipate when I planned the transaction. Carl had said, what is the methodology that the story describes? Conrad had said, it depends on who is telling the story. The version circulating through the dealerships describes a farmer who accumulated money privately and surprised the dealerships with a large cash purchase. That version is accurate as far as it goes. The version that would be more useful to other farming operations would describe the two fund columns and the reading series and the land acquisition methodology and the reputation approach, the four instruments that together produced the outcome. The one-sentence version and the four-instrument version describe the same event from different levels of specificity. Carl had said the Farm Bureau meeting was closer to the four-instrument version. Conrad had said yes. That is why I answered the specific questions at the Farm Bureau meeting rather than the general questions. The general answer, he had money, is not useful. The specific answer, here are the instruments and how they work together, is potentially useful to anyone who wants to apply it. Carl had asked, why didn't you apply it publicly earlier? You could have described the methodology through the Extension Service or the Farm Bureau at any point in the last 30 years. Conrad had said, the methodology is not a discovery. The Extension Service documentation from the late 1950s describes the compression reading methodology. The accumulation column approach is as old as the practice of keeping farm accounts. The reputation-based land acquisition approach has been described in agricultural economics literature since the 1940s. There is no part of the methodology that I discovered or that was not available to anyone who wanted to look for it. The application of all four instruments simultaneously, consistently, across 3.5 decades is the contribution. And that contribution is not something you can describe persuasively until you have the evidence. The evidence arrived in October. Carl had said, the 30 tractors are the evidence. Conrad had said, the 30 tractors and the 1,740 acres, and the zero institutional debt and the equipment fund balance that the bank letter described. All of those together are the evidence. Anyone alone could be achieved through other means. Together they describe a specific approach applied consistently over a specific period. That is what the Farm Bureau meeting heard and what was worth hearing. Carl had written in his own farm management notebook, a practice he had maintained since the late 1970s, when Conrad had encouraged him to keep notes from the kitchen table discussions. The description that Conrad had just given, he had written, methodology, evidence requirements, all four instruments together, consistently applied over the full duration. Individual elements can be achieved by other means. The combination over the duration is the evidence. He had also written 30 tractors and 11 seconds, then 0, then rebuild, then reading series from new baselines, then whatever the decades produce. That was the methodology. That was the farm account's discipline expressed in practice. That was the whole account. Carl had been at the kitchen table making the first December 1987 entries in both fund columns since Conrad's hand had been unsteady from the exertion of the December coordination work. He had made the entries in his own handwriting for the first time. The equipment fund opening balance 0, 10%, established rate. The land fund opening balance 0, 6%, established rate. 2 fund columns, 2 zeros, 2 rebuild entries in Carl's handwriting. The column entries had been in Conrad's handwriting since 1950 and 1955. The December 1987 entries were the transition from Conrad's hand to Carl's. Both zeros, both rebuilding, at the established rates, as they had always rebuilt, after every deployment, from every zero. Conrad had said, watching Carl make the entries, "The rates do not change." Carl had said, "I know." Conrad had said, "The rates are not arbitrary. The 10% and the 6% are the rates that the farm's income can sustain in the difficult years, without the columns going to zero involuntarily. The rates can sustain in any year. If the contribution in a difficult year reduces the operating reserve below the minimum, the rates are too high. If the contribution in a good year does not accumulate toward the threshold fast enough, the rates are too low. The rates are calibrated to the farm's income across its full range of conditions." Carl had said, "I will calibrate them as the conditions change." Conrad had said, "Yes, the rates may need adjustment as the scale grows or as the income conditions change. The calibration is the job. The commitment to the rates as calibrated is the discipline. The calibration is the intelligence. The discipline is the execution." Carl had made the final entries. He had closed the composition book. He had put it in the filing cabinet. The farm account was in the filing cabinet. The equipment fund was at zero in Carl's handwriting. The land fund was at zero in Carl's handwriting. The reading series for 30 new machines was beginning in the spring of 1988. The baselines would be established. The drift rate would begin accumulating. In 22 years, some of those readings would be as old as the oldest readings in the 1987 fleet assessment. In 37 years, the equipment fund would have rebuilt from the December 1987 zero to whatever the 37 years of rebuilding produced at the rates the calibration specified. The discipline would be in the composition books, in Carl's handwriting, and then in whoever came after Carl, in the same columns, at the calibrated rates. From every zero, that was the whole account. That was everything. The silence had been 11 seconds in October. The rebuild was beginning in December. The farm continued, the discipline continued. That was sufficient, that was everything.